Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm Chris Pareja. I'm your host for this evening, and tonight we have the honor of, this is kind of a record-setting evening. Mimi Steel is joining us to give us an update on Plan Bay Area and the various things that California elected and unelected bureaucrats are doing to unleash their tyrannical rule upon the citizens of California. And Mimi, thanks for joining us. But the reason I say it's kind of a record-setting evening is you're the first guest we've allowed to come on twice, other than maybe Howard Myers, who has underwritten the show for the Conservative Forum. So welcome back.
Thank you. I feel honored to be here.
Well, as always, honored to have you around. So tell us a little bit about what's happening since you were last here. There's been the fight, so Plan Bay Area has gotten through. There are people that are doing some good things, and there are people that are being frustrated. What's going on?
So Plan Bay Area is a 25-year plan. It combines housing, transportation, and land use. It's brought to you by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats who think that they know better than you how and where you should live, how you should commute to work. So it's very much of a top-down central plan. And I always tell people it's a 25-year plan, and you know the Soviets only had 5-year plans. So this is what our unelected officials are wreaking havoc with us in the Bay Area. The plan did pass on July 18th, and the irony is that it passed on the same day that Detroit declared bankruptcy, which I thought was quite appropriate because of the direction that we're going with all of these high-density housing, near mass transit, all of the money that California doesn't have that they're going to spend in order to promote this type of growth. We're going to end up in the same kind of situation as Detroit is. We're going to kick businesses out of the area, even though Silicon Valley right now looks great. You know, who would have thought Detroit back in the 60s would end up being bankrupt? And we're going, unfortunately, down that same path. So the plan was passed on the 18th of July. What we've done now is we've taken the fight local. And we have teams of people from all around the Bay. This affects every county and every 101 cities in the Bay Area. The plan calls for high-density housing near mass transit in every single town, and it is going to, and ultimately it's going to make your local elected officials irrelevant.
Right, with legislation going through like SB 1 and some of the other things that directly take power away from city councils, from the local electeds, and give it to many versions of the Association of Bay Area Governments or the Metropolitan Transit Commission. So yeah, they take it away and they give it to people who don't care, who are going to profit or who can be cronies, and let them do what they're going to do.
Well, it was very interesting. Right after the plan passed, Mark Luce, who is the president of the Association of Bay Area Governments, had a seminar, and they had 450 people who were in the high finance and in the big builder community, hearing from Mark how they were going to profit from Plan Bay Area. So all of this development is really focused on the high-density housing near mass transit. It has to be subsidized in order to make it work. There's no free market aspect to this here. And, you know, traditionally, issues of transportation and land use and housing were always done locally. It was a community's decision as to what they wanted to do. If you want to be like San Francisco and live in high-density housing, that's great. But you've got towns like Saratoga and Los Gatos and Marin and towns in the East Bay that really want to be suburban or rural communities, and yet Plan Bay Area would force all of these towns to have basically the same type of template, a mass transit center and high-density housing.
And it doesn't make housing any more affordable or safer to live in. We read some of the disclaimers in the plan when we were out fighting it, and when you see that you're not even allowed to put senior citizens on the bottom levels of these buildings because of pollution concerns. You're not allowed to put daycares down there, but that's where people are supposed to work 8 hours a day when they're working in their livable communities, right? And they use the flowery terms of high-density housing near mass transit, and they say that they need these things. And I took them to task. You were there in those circumstances. I said, look, you specifically said you need this stuff because minorities are going to be living in the Bay Area, specifically Asians and Hispanics, and they tend to prefer low-income housing and have multiple families in the same building and can't afford cars, and they like low-paying jobs, so we've got to have this stuff. I call them the racists they were, but I mean, when we take all the flowers off, basically what they're saying is we need to put these minorities in human kennels by the train tracks and the railroad lines, the bus lines, and the freeway, and, you know, leave the other stuff for the other people. It's just, it's hideous. It's not safe.
It's a very elitist approach.
Yeah.
It's these bureaucrats who do not live in this type of housing.
And don't want to.
And don't want to, and will never live in this type of housing, who want you to live in this type of housing and not have a car. And they basically are killing the American dream. You know, one of the things that we talked about earlier is the fact that you can't you can't defy the rules of gravity, and yet these people are trying to defy the rules of gravity. So when you look at Plan Bay Area and the rules of economics, when you look at Plan Bay Area, they supposedly want affordable housing and they want open space. Well, open space effectively takes property out of production. They're going to force all of this development in 5% of the landmass of the Bay Area,
Right.
and then they wonder why housing is expensive. Well, you just took, it's a simple supply and demand, economics 101, that these people have no clue about. You just took all that property out of production, and now you're forcing people into smaller and smaller areas. On top of that, they complain that people are buying houses out in the Central Valley and commuting in. They don't want people to drive that distance. Well, why are they buying out there? Because they can afford housing out there.
Exactly. And we looked at, you did, we were working on a project together, and you actually did some research on the cost of some of these high-density units, like in Dublin, where they're doing apartment housing, basically, for families. And the affordable housing was $4,000 a month for rent?
Yes, and they were subsidizing a family of 4 that earned up to $120,000. So essentially what you have is the taxpayer is subsidizing people. A lot of times a taxpayer who's making less money than the people that they are subsidizing to move into these units. So it really doesn't make any sense.
That just sounds so fair to me.
Right. Well, and on top of that, the thing that's concerning that's on the horizon is what you referred to earlier, which is SB1, Senate Bill SB1. It's being promoted by Darrell Steinberg, who is the person who brought us SB 375, which is the law that required Plan Bay Area.
But he's termed out now, right?
He's termed out,
yeah.
but he's going for it, right? This is going to be his last gift to us right before the end. And the thing with SB1 is it would allow, it would change the definition of blight.
Right.
And what would essentially happen is that it would allow them to declare land that isn't used efficiently to be blight.
Right.
Well, what does that mean? In their terminology, it could mean that there might be some private homes, single-family homes, in a town like Los Gatos or Los Altos, and they might have 4 people to a home, 10 homes, 40 people. Well, if they tore all those homes down and put in a high-rise, they could maybe house a couple hundred people. And so that's a more efficient use of land. So under SB1, it would, number one, it would fund Plan Bay Area. And number 2, it would give them unprecedented authority to declare eminent domain on inefficient land use.
Well, an inefficient land use in these particular individuals' minds could also mean not just the houses where they want to put high density, it could mean that it's a suburban or it's even a rural kind of a community that's just, you could put more cars there and everything if the ranches went away, or you could put more buildings, or you could just remove everything and return it to leaves and grass and bugs, and it would be a happier place. So it's wild to believe that these things are happening, but you touched on something there that I think is important. People look at this and they say, okay, well, how bad could Plan Bay Area be on its own? Well, if you look at the individual pieces, maybe they seem innocuous enough. But when you put them all together and you understand what the overall objective is, then it becomes a little bit more scary or dangerous, to the point where people would think you're crazy if you actually told them the truth, except you can present it to them in writing because these people are open about what they're doing.
I have been called crazy. I have been called somebody who's fear-mongering. I've been called, and we have a group. We have people all around the Bay that are fighting this in their local communities. And there's a group up in Marin, which is a very, very liberal area. And many of the people on our side in the Marin argument are very liberal people, and they're being pummeled by the people who are in favor of the plan, and they're being called racists and NIMBYs and all kinds of names. And the really sad part about this is that the language that's being used is used to manipulate people, to hide what's really happening.
To bully people. I've heard those terms in communities before. Bullying is what these people are doing.
We are getting bullied
Yes.
because a term for what's happening is smart growth. Well, if you're against it, you must be stupid, right? Sustainable communities is another term that they use to mask what's really happening. Well, what does that mean? Well, sustainable communities really is something that's literally unsustainable, but it sounds good. You know, who would be against sustainable communities? You must be somebody who doesn't care about the future.
Right.
Another term they use a lot, which really frustrates me, is open space. Open space starts out as somebody's private property, and it effectively gets stolen by these open space authorities, because what they do is they put so many restrictions on the property that a private rancher or a private homeowner can't afford to keep the property. And then the property gets picked up by a regional park, and which can't afford to maintain it. The person is off the property, and ultimately that's the goal. The goal, as you said earlier, is to put us in these human settlements, human kennels, where everybody's all squished together in the urban area, and we're going to leave the pristine area for the wild things.
Well, and some examples of that people may not put this all together, but we talk about things like Drake's Bay or the issues at Golden Gate Park. Enlighten the viewers a little bit about those topics.
Okay, let's start with Golden Gate Park, because I'm a real dog fan. When that park was set up, the agreement was that it would, in perpetuity, be available to people and dogs. And there are certain areas in the park where they have off-leash areas for the dogs. That park was turned over to the federal government. And now what the federal government is doing is saying, we're going to take away all of the off-leash parks. Well, that's just the first step, because they'll take away the off-leash parks first, then they'll eliminate the dogs, and then eventually they'll eliminate the people. So this is a very insidious kind of thing that's happening. They're gradually, the frog in the pot, they're gradually boiling away our rights to access property. The other piece is Drake's Bay, and as you know, there's an oyster farm there that the federal government has been trying to shut down. Not only are they trying to shut down that oyster farm, and that is right now in a Pacific Legal Foundation has a lawsuit against them, and they're trying to get it up to the Supreme Court and not let these people be shut down. But that area was set aside, the oyster farm and all of the ranches in the area, they were set aside as a working landscape. That was the agreement that was made with the government.
And it's a sustainable business.
And it's a sustainable business, and the ranches, the farms around there are all sustainable, but the federal government is trying to kill Drake's Bay Oyster Farm, which means the oysters are going to have to be flown in from China or someplace to supply the kind of oysters. So, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But the other piece of it is we found a document that basically said the first thing we're going to do is get rid of the oysters. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go after all of the ranchers that are in this area, and we're going to use the environmentalists to shut them down. So if you fast forward, if Drake's Bay is not successful, and you fast forward 10 or 20 years, that is all going to be wilderness area. There's going to be no human access allowed at all, and the federal government will have its wish, which is to get people off of the land.
And people would think you were crazy. Except that it's true.
Except that it's true. That's
not the
right.
crazy part. Well, we all have our tendencies.
But yeah, right?
But so what other things are happening? Are there places that the citizens are winning, like in Marin, as an example?
Yeah. So there are a lot of positive things that are happening, and what's happening up in Marin is they've launched some recall issues against some of the elected officials that have been promoting this stuff. They were able to get several priority development areas. These are the areas that are set aside for these high-rise buildings to go in, the high-density housing. They were able to get several of those delisted, which means they're not going to have the buildings there. They've created quite a ruckus up there, and I think the public officials are starting to get concerned about the level of angst that's happening in the area. Another positive thing is in Palo Alto, there was a high-density area, I think it was called Maybell, and they put up a big fight over that. It was going to be another one of those 5-story, mega developments, and the city council approved it. The voters put an initiative on the ballot, said we don't want this, and the voters won. And so that's another good area.
Well, and that's exactly why these people have been trying to keep the votes away from the people, because if the people have the opportunity to learn about what's happening and to defend themselves, then they will. And so the idea is to keep it below the radar so that people don't have any idea what's happening, any choice in the decision, and then they can push it through in the middle of the night. Literally.
Yeah.
When Plan Bay Area was approved, it was like 11 o'clock at night. By the time all the protesters were done, which was 97% of the audience, and they still passed it.
Yeah, they really weren't listening. They're so used to not having any opposition. I think that's the thing that I've learned out of all of this stuff. They've just been used to having their own little clique of the public officials and these non-governmental agencies that are out there promoting this. And I always tell people, government goes to those who show up, and the reason we're in the position we're in is our own fault on some level. I mean, we're all busy and everything, but we've kind of turned the keys to the kingdom over to these people, and they're not supporting us. They're supporting their own political agendas. Yeah. And I think it's a shame, but more people have to start stepping up and getting involved in government, and specifically local government. Go to your city council, meet with your mayor, meet with your planning department, figure out what's going on, and make them understand that you don't like what's happening. And people sometimes say to me, well, what's your ultimate goal? And I say, my ultimate goal is to create outrage. Because
you're not a fear monger. You're a rage monger.
That's right. If I wanted to go over to the dark side and work for some of these non-governmental organizations, there are lots of places I could go. But there's nobody supporting our point of view. There's no organization really out there fighting for property rights and the average middle-class American who has the American dream of owning a home and having a car. Nobody's fighting for us. And so the first step, I think, in all of this, I don't have any funding. I don't have deep pockets. I don't have a George Soros that I can go to. Yeah. So the bottom line is to just get people aware. That's the first step.
Right.
And so I've really been fortunate. I've been on the radio a bunch of times. We have a coalition now of 40 organizations all over the Bay Area that are fighting this plan. We meet every other month to share stories and to help each other and to come up with different ideas on how we're going to approach it. And I hope what's going to happen ultimately is there's this big groundswell of, we are not happy campers. You guys need to take another look at all of this.
Well, and it's also interesting because the place where you've been meeting recently is a former military base. So we're even reusing property that's been
sustainable.
Yeah. and you drive through those places and you see the boarded up windows and everything else, where if you would just give people the ability to use some of that land that already was used for housing and things in the past, you wouldn't have to be tormenting all of the people who own land currently and coercing them into life scenarios that they really don't want to be in the first place.
But then you wouldn't be able to control them. And see the whole thing, I mean, I kind of hate to say it like this, but the whole thing is about control. There are our betters who are in the political structure, both politicians and bureaucrats, and they know what's best for us lowly people. And so they're
I need to point out that's sarcasm for people who don't pick up on social cueing. Yes.
And so the bottom line is they have an agenda. Literally, they have an agenda, and they're going to impose it on us. And it's as I said earlier, it's kind of happens gradually, but one day you're going to wake up. If anybody ever goes out to the East Bay and looks at the town of Dublin, that place is really, really an example of it looks like downtown San Francisco almost.
Well, the buildings aren't quite as tall yet. But people don't realize, I mean, the scenario used to be in suburban types of communities. I mean, you might put 4, 6, 8 houses on an acre, something like that. But these plans call for 30 units per acre.
Sometimes 40.
Well, the 30 is where you start to get the funding assistance from the federal or the state government. And so they're looking at really densifying the area. And when that happens, I mean, the jerk factor goes up, right? Even if the majority of the people are good, you're putting more idiots in close range with people who are going to be affected by the idiocy, right? And so crime goes up. You know, people get into more skirmishes with one another. And it's really not a pleasant lifestyle for people who didn't want to be there in the first place, but feel like that's their only choice.
Well, and the other side of it, too, that a lot of people don't get is it changes the voting demographics. Because if you start moving people into different communities, you're going to have, the way the plan works is there's certain percentages of income levels that have to be in each community. So you have very low income and low income people. You start moving those people in, and if we call them the takers as opposed to the makers, then what's going to happen to your voting? They're going to start voting for more things to be burdened on the taxpayer who is actually going to be paying, and ultimately you won't be able to stop any of these tax measures.
Well, I mean, there is that aspect of it to some degree, but one of the things that bothers me is that these plans even go to the level of trying to determine how many of which type of people, not just economically, but based on their ethnic background and everything else, instead of letting communities grow the way that they want to grow. I mean, some communities are tighter knit where you will have pockets of quote-unquote used to be minority groups, but we're a very diverse culture, especially in California. And so one could argue that the former majorities are now the minorities. But you look at these things, and people should be allowed to go where they want to go, where they can afford to go, and they shouldn't be disincented for trying to achieve and get out of their particular class or social assignment. There should be no social assignments. You should be able to do what you want to do.
Well, it's the ultimate thing about do we have a colorblind society, which was really the objective of Martin Luther King, that you were judged by what you could do. You know, you get into a neighborhood because you can afford to get into that neighborhood. It shouldn't matter what your ethnicity is. And we've gone completely away from that. I mean, we really have regressed on some level.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and it's a shame because we're by trying to avoid looking at everything through colored filters. That's exactly what we're doing. It's upside down world. But we only have about a minute left. Tell us a little bit more about how people can find out about you, the things you're working on, and the things that your coalition is working on as well.
Okay, well, we have a website. It's called bayarealiberty.org. If people go to that website, right on the front, there's a thing that says sign up for our email list. If they put their name in there, they'll get emails from me. I send a couple out a week talking about different meetings in the area, things they can do. If you're with an organization that would like to join our coalition, they can email me at sfinfo@proprights.org, which is also on the website, and I'll get back in touch with them, and we'll let them know what's happening with the meetings and the coalitions.
Well, thank you for informing the audience tonight and for all of the informing that you do on a regular basis. And obviously, we'll be in touch and hopefully have you on again in the future.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Mimi. And on that note, we'll be right back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum.
The Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley began with 20 conservatives meeting at a restaurant in November of 2003. Our mission is to promote the principles of American liberty through education. By 2012, we had grown to over 600 paid members. Our monthly meetings feature well-known and prestigious conservative speakers addressing issues that are critical to our country's very survival. This includes speakers like Victor Davis Hanson, Andrew Breitbart, David Horowitz, and many others. In addition to our monthly meetings, we sponsor a conservative local cable access TV show, The Right Side, covering today's topics. Our Constitution discussion group not only teaches the Constitution, but started our annual essay contest that awards 2 $1,000 scholarships to local high school seniors. We are a virtual clearinghouse for grassroots organizations by providing them with table space at no charge in our exhibit area. There are typically a dozen groups represented. If you are like-minded, join us at our next meeting and become motivated and empowered. Liberty, made in America.
And welcome back to The Right Side. That was a word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum. And we appreciate them making this show possible, but really what they're best known for is their speaker series. And usually this occurs on the first Tuesday night of the month. That will be changing in November, and it sometimes changes in July as well. But typically the meetings happen at 432 Sterling Road here in Mountain View, about 3 minutes from the studio. And as an example tonight, Victor Davis Hanson is speaking. In March, Greg Lukianoff, the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, will be speaking. In April, Dr. Bert Folsom from Hillsdale. He's a professor and a well-known author. And then in May, we're expecting a big turnout for Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who will be in from Maricopa County, Arizona, talking to us a little bit about things like border enforcement. So just closing with Mimi, we've been in the trenches together for the last several years, fighting for the property rights of the citizens in the Bay Area, many of whom don't know that there is a battle that's being waged and they're losing and didn't even know they were at war. Learn more about Mimi and Caper and what they're doing, as well as the other coalition members, one of which is the Conservative Forum, where there are people that are out there trying to stand up for your rights in your absence, but be present. Educate your neighbors. Help them understand that you, as individuals, can make a big difference if you stand united and stand up for what you believe in, what's yours, and help them protect what's theirs. On that note, I'd like to thank you for joining us on The Right Side this evening. I've been your host, Chris Pareja, and I still will be after the camera turns off. But we look forward to seeing you again, either in person or on the show sometime soon. Have a great night.